Now, climate change has dominated headlines with a number of activists coming together to find ways to save the Earth. Now, today we'll be looking at the emission of greenhouse gases and the effect they have on climate change, or perhaps not. To chat with us about this and a whole lot more, I'm joined in studio by a nuclear physicist as well as a CEO at Newzroom Afrika, Dr. Kelvin Kemm. Doc, thank you very much for your time. Welcome to Newzroom Afrika.
Thank you.
Now, there's obviously a big debate around climate change, whether or not it's true, whether or not we're seeing changing weather patterns, and if that's an anomaly. But I was hoping we'd take a step back as first. People often speak about carbon emissions, right, and how that has an effect because of greenhouse gases. I don't want to take it for granted that everybody knows what that means. So perhaps let's start by defining these ideas. What is this carbon element? Why is that so important? And where does the greenhouse gas term enter the fray?
Well, where the greenhouse gas comes in is that carbon dioxide forms a blanket around the Earth. And when infrared radiation comes in from outer space, there's a law of physics that says when radiation comes in, it's got to go out at a lower wavelength than it came in. And it effectively comes through a window. And then when it goes out, it changes position slightly. When it goes back up, it can't get out the same window, so to speak. So some of the heat gets trapped in the atmosphere that way. Thank heavens, because that is why we can live on planet Earth. The entire Earth is at an average temperature of about 15 if you go around the entire planet, polar regions and tropical regions and so on. If it wasn't for that greenhouse effect, we would have just been a big snowball and ice ball from the beginning of time, and there probably would be no life on the planet. So we need the greenhouse effect. What's happened the last number of years is people are talking about an enhanced greenhouse effect. That means it's getting more so. Now that is where I have a disagreement with how this is argued. There's undoubtedly been some temperature rise. If I do this and I do that with my hands have warmed up by more than 1 degree C since the days of Sharka. Now people are saying since the days of Sharka till now, the planet has warmed by that much. Therefore it's a catastrophe. I don't think it's a catastrophe. They're arguing that the increased CO2, which we have had without a doubt, we're now up to 0.04% of the composition of the atmosphere, 0.04%, and it used to be 0.03. So it's a minute amount that has changed. And they're saying this is causing warming, it's going to run into runaway warming, and it's all a catastrophe. It does not seem to be the case. The global warming that we've seen at the moment is much more likely to be linked to magnetic variations in the sun.
Okay.
If we go back to the 1400s, 1500s, times like that, we had a period called the medieval warm period, when it was warmer than now. That was when the Vikings were farming sheep and so on in Greenland. And the world was a different place. Then we went into a little ice age at the time of Shakespeare, which was also the time that Jan van Riebeeck landed at the Cape. And the Thames in London froze over to such a degree you could ride coaches, horse-drawn coaches down the Thames. So there's been dramatic increases and decreases in temperature for very many years now that had nothing to do with any industrial CO2, which they say since the industrial times, which is since the time of Sharka. So this is just plain and simply being carried away. Then they say, oh, this now brings on extreme weather events. It doesn't. There have been extreme weather events for all time. If you look at the US, for example, the decade during which most hurricanes hit the United States coast was the 1940s, not now. There's been no increase. In fact, it's not one of the higher decades, the last one. So these stories about all this disaster and that are just plain and simply not true. It's probably totally normal and it's totally attached to the magnetic variations of the sun. So there's no need for panic stations. Just finally, with the CO2, which you mentioned at the beginning, plants use CO2 to grow. And you find that the more CO2 there is in the atmosphere, the more plants grow. So it's good for the planet. Crops grow, we get more food, we get more crops, we get general greening of the planet. We've been through a CO2 starvation period for some time now, so thank heavens the CO2 is going up, so we get better plant growth. So the panic is really misplaced.
Wow. An extraordinary dismissal of some of the most active political scenes we've seen throughout the world, really.
Absolutely.
From Greta Thunberg, the Swedish teenager. I'd love to see the conversation you'd have with her, because I think you guys have a few disagreements. But more recently also to the protests happening in London. The question then I want to ask is, Why, if you think that people are making a storm in a teacup out of all of this, surely there must be a motive for that. I mean, from your understanding, why would people then exaggerate what you say is really a pattern that we've seen exist for years?
Well, I think there's a mentality at the moment, people want to gain political power. Some of the green people, they want to tell you what you must eat and what you must do and what you must do. And that to have something like a disaster, the planet is going to collapse, is a great way to do this.
Wow.
And so what happens is that information comes into day-to-day magazines that you get in the street corner cafe and so on. And that's the source of information for most people. Greta Thunberg, as you say, really does one believe that a 16-year-old schoolgirl knows more than very many scientists around the world that have studied this for a lifetime?
Well, there are some scientists agreeing with her, and this is, I think, the point of contention.
Actually, there's a huge amount like me that do not agree with her.
Right.
But what you find is that the media gives lots of coverage to the other side, and when people like me go along and say, look at this, now what happens is the public gets very misinformed. Now, South Africa, numbers of people now are starting to see the light and say, wait, maybe this is not like this. For example, in South Africa, there's what's become a rather well-known WhatsApp group now, with all sorts of people. And it started with trade unionists, and now there's scientists on it, and engineers and accountants, and all sorts of people on this WhatsApp group. It's a great bunch of guys, run by people like Adil and Chabaleng, Zach Madela.
And what's in this WhatsApp group?
And they're starting to say,
about?
what is going on? And it's quite interesting to people are saying to each other, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. For example, wind and solar power. The reason why there's a big push to say put wind and solar power in, that this is supposed to save carbon dioxide being emitted by the coal-fired power stations, which is supposed to save the planet. Now, the CO2 doesn't matter. What's far worse out of power stations like coal power stations is sulfur dioxide, which if it gets into water turns into sulfuric acid, gets in your gutters and rots your gutters. Now those type of problems have been addressed for years. We haven't solved them all. But particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, they call them SOxes and NOxes, those are far more important than CO2. CO2 is not a pollutant. You and I are breathing it out now as we speak to one another. It's not a pollutant. So it's just been so misguided, and thank heavens people like these groups, the WhatsApp group and various others are starting to say, look at this sensibly. Their claims, for example, look at all the work opportunities that you're going to get out of solar and wind power. The answer is they're not there. It's not true. And unfortunately, a lot of misinformation is spread around as a justification for taking these radical stances, because the people say, we've got to do this because we want the power. They want to say, us extreme Greens are going to tell you what car you're allowed to drive. There's now a campaign on Leonardo DiCaprio that is saying, stop eating red meat. They want hamburgers banned.
Okay, let's hold that thought for now.
How extreme can you go?
Right. And it's a fascinating take on what I think has been a narrative that has been bought by many people. I'm interested to find out whether or not you even believe this idea that there's currently a heat wave in Gauteng. That's been making headlines across the country for some time now. But we'll do that and a whole lot more when we come back after the break. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You're still live on Newsworld, right here on Newzroom Afrika, channel 405. We're talking global climate change, or perceptions at least that the climate is changing. And for this, I'm joined in studio by nuclear physicist Dr. Kelvin Kemm, who's also the CEO of Nuclear Afrika. Now, just before the break, you had completely dismissed all kinds of assertions that we'd heard over the past couple of weeks around climate change and the ways in which temperatures are changing. And you're maintaining that this is actually nothing new. In fact, in front of me here, I have a book that you have authored that I understand paints this picture, that the kind of weather patterns that we're seeing today have existed for many, many years. So, based on that, when you hear reports of a heat wave in the country being an anomaly, how do you think that kind of information should be treated? Is this as different as people would like us believe?
I think that you should treat that information with a bit of suspicion and say, is it true? Where does it come from? You know, it's very easy to believe people. You make reference to that book. In that book, it'll indicate that it has snowed in Pietermaritzburg. It has snowed in Piet Retief. There have been floods in like 1890 something or other. There have been all sorts of amazing weather patterns have happened in South Africa. That book covers the last 150 years of South African weather. And it opened my eyes when I did all the research for that, to see what was snowing in Pietermaritzburg. If tomorrow it snowed in Pietermaritzburg, oh, that's climate change. That's definitely due to you eating hamburgers, you must stop. But it's happened before. Now, I've seen on television, they interview some farmer and they say, look, there's this terrible drought or something. He says, yes. They say, do you think it's climate change? And the farmer says, yes. They say, terrible drought, isn't it? And he said, yes. It's nearly as bad as the 1964 one, but not as bad as the 1952 one. Now, if there was a 1964 flood and a 1952 flood, how come the one now is due to climate change, but the other two weren't? So this is just not on. There is climate change, but the little bit that you've seen, which is this 1 degree Sanshaka, is giving rise to some slight variations, which has always happened. There's always gentle drifts going, and we can see it coming from the magnetic field of the sun. That you can monitor quite easily in the sense of sunspots, which are spots on the sun, and they indicate solar storms. When there's few sunspots, it leads to global cooling. At the moment, the number of sunspots has been going down. And few people know that there's been no global warming since 1998, none in this century. And if you look up on the internet, they refer to it as the pause. If you go to the global warming enthusiasts and say, but you said there's global warming, but there hasn't been any this century. No, they say it's a pause. It's really there, but it's hiding, but it's all going to come back when you're not looking. Now, really, that's not scientific. The CO2 has continued to go up since the year 2000. How come the temperature's been static if these two are directly linked? And they're not. You'll generally find, too, that the CO2 rise comes after the temperature rise, not the other way around.
Interesting.
We know that if you want to make those cold drinks with those soda stream machines, you take the bottle of water and you put it in the fridge. And when the cold water goes into the soda stream, it sucks up much more CO2 than warm water, because cold water will pull in more carbon dioxide than warm water will. So when the ocean starts to warm a bit, it pushes carbon dioxide out. So that's where a lot of carbon dioxide comes from. So a lot of the stories that go around just keep snowballing, and people are not going back to say, where's the actual science that says this? These climate activists, like the people in London you referred to, you must see pictures of some of them, dressed up as clowns and so on and so forth, banging their bongo drums in the street. This is hardly scientifically inspiring.
Sure. And perhaps an argument could be made that, I guess, the lack of information around the ways in which the immediate environment is changing is perhaps what the main issue is at the moment. But I wanted to ask you this. Are you then suggesting that there's absolutely no need for people to change their lifestyles? There's absolutely no need for people to be cognizant of the ways in which they eat, they dress, and they operate, dare I say, in cities like Johannesburg and many other cities across the world? Is business as usual not equal death, as is being suggested? And perhaps death is an extreme final outcome. But the way we're operating now, are you suggesting that it's perfectly fine and has no effect on the environment?
Pretty much, yes, as far as the CO2 is concerned.
Wow.
The environment, you've got to not put chemicals in the rivers. We don't want litter. We don't want plastic bags flying around. And plastic bags, the issue of plastic bags flying around is not charging people for plastic bags at the supermarket. It's having people having a consciousness of looking after their environment. We don't want crud in the air. You don't want horrible chemicals released in the air. But you know, it's interesting that now people are living around the planet more healthily than ever before. Do you know when the highest incidence of smog took place in London? It was, as I recall, 1896, I think it was, or 1897. Since then, it's been better. And yet, when you read in certain newspapers, air pollution's going up, listen, it actually isn't. Nearly everywhere, things are improving. It doesn't mean we got it all right. Certainly, there's lots of things to fix. We need to stop the rhino poaching. We need to stop the elephant poaching. That's far more serious than somebody's factory producing CO2 or coal-fired power stations producing CO2. That doesn't matter. What matters there is like sulfur dioxide coming out, or maybe particulate matter that lands on your sheets on your washing line. So those are the things. So the action that you get now to promote solar power, which you only get in the daytime and you only get full intensity at lunchtime, and then try to stop something reliable like coal-fired power and nuclear-fired power. It's just more expensive, and they use a term like the just transition. And the just transition is sort of code words for more expensive and less reliable. And people don't spot this, and they feel emotionally bound to come along and want to save the planet and join the team and so on. So crowds follow Greta, and they really don't know what they're following for. It just feels good. That's nice for their spirit. want a compliment for them to being good-hearted, but they're wrong. You know?
Sure. There's something has to be said around the sustainability of using fossil fuels.
Yes.
Though. I mean, we do know, for instance, that it takes years for coal to develop, and many other fossil fuels. The reserves of natural gas, for instance, have a prospect of running out. How do you respond then to that critique that perhaps, before we get to that point where all these resources are depleted, it's probably worthwhile imagining other ways through which we could, maintain the kind of lifestyles that we're living and meet the energy demands that we have?
Yes, now that's a very good point. In Europe, for example, a couple of centuries ago, Europe was covered in forests, and they cut the wood down, and they burnt the wood. When they started to run out of wood, they discovered peat. They dug up peat, which is semi-formed coal. Then they discovered coal and found it was more difficult now to get the coal because you've got to dig down to go and get the coal. They did coal. So we're going through that phase at the moment. Coal, as you said earlier, is a very big contributor to energy around the planet. I believe in centuries to come, the world will be 100% nuclear, and we will look back to the era that we passed through the coal. But right now, we've got to go through coal. We've got to do it in the cleanest possible way. There's new, more efficient methods of burning coal at better temperatures under generally better controlled conditions. So I don't see any problem with emitting CO2. In fact, the Earth is starved of CO2. We need to double it.
Wow.
What we've also got to look at is that we need to double electricity consumption. I was pleased to see this morning when Minister Gwedi Mantashe announced his new integrated resource plan for energy development, that he had nuclear in it, he had coal in it, and he said, we've got to go for more electricity. Stories that we've got to keep electricity consumption flat are wrong. We've got to say South Africa's got to double its electricity consumption. I emphasize not wastefully.
Yes.
But there must be people out in rural areas now that are sitting around fires. They are producing all sorts of muck into the air, burning fires. They'd be much better off plugging into electricity, having electric lights, having a stove to cook on, and so on and so forth. Around Africa, there are millions of people in Africa who've got no electric lights at all. So you want to be able to bring them electricity. There are African countries that are 10% electrified. The only honourable thing they can do is aim to double it, the electricity consumption, then double again, then double again, then double again. So trying to sell stories from Germany and Switzerland and so on, oh, cut back on your electricity consumption, don't use electricity, is wrong. We're in a developmental phase in Africa. We've got to go for much more electricity. We need more factories, more motor car exports, more development of everything, done always in a more efficient fashion than before if we can help it. Every new air conditioner that comes out ideally should use less electricity per thermal unit of energy that it removes from the air. So I'm not saying be wasteful, because my critics will come along and say, you said waste energy and don't care. I'm not. I'm a physicist. From day one, we trained on energy efficiency and knowing exactly where all the energy flows. So be sensible. But we need the engineers, the scientists, the economists of the country to get together and build the economy, and not think that it's all going to go along on breezes and sunbeams.
And I'll piggyback on the idea of coming together, because I think that's probably the most important concept in this whole conversation. I can imagine an instance, for instance, where scientists on both sides of this conversation play table tennis with facts that support their own arguments. I think a more constructive approach, though, is trying to find ways through which there can be collaboration between people who view these things differently. Do you think there's space for that? Because at the end of the day, I imagine it doesn't really help that there's an argument where people potentially are speaking across each other as opposed to speaking to each other, because the idea, of course, is to save the kind of planet that we all live on, even if it's to save us from delusion, but as I think is the kind of, dare I say, mission that you're on, insofar as climate change is concerned.
Absolutely, and I agree with you entirely. Now, one thing I must say is that scientists and engineers around the world are generally pretty jolly bad at talking to the public and talking to the media.
So that's the actual problem.
So that's undoubtedly been a problem. I'm a nuclear scientist, and I know I've got nuclear science colleagues in the United States and countries around the world, and they all admit, and that's why Greta has possibly done us a world of good now. In the last couple of weeks, there's all sorts of nuclear scientists and people like that that I know in countries like the US who would sit quietly in the laboratories and keep their mouths shut. All of a sudden, these guys are outside now writing newspaper stories, going and giving speeches saying, look, this has just gone too far, this is ridiculous. So it's galvanized people to come out and tell the truth. So what has happened is that so many scientists who agree with people like me, there was a petition that came out a number of days ago now. There's now 1,000 international scientists who signed this petition. I'm one of the ones who was invited to sign it, which I did. to say, look, this is just plain wrong. This whole Greta story and about catastrophe, is just plain wrong. And, but we need that to get publicity, because what happens now is one magazine article in Fair Lady or Cosmo or something gets more coverage to say we're all going to fry and die than the more sober scientific statement that comes out to say this is plain and simply incorrect. And that's why I'm so pleased to see so many South Africans now, led by people like Adil and Zach and numbers of others. Lady Letty in Cape Town, who I've never met, but she says great things. There's all sorts of fine people there that come along and say, look, it's time we actually thought about this, because this isn't logical when you start to put it together. And I'm appealing for people to not just open any old magazine, read something and believe it. Say, wait a minute, can that be true? And often just a little bit of thought shows you it can't be true. You know, a fundamental thing, for example, say we get this global warming and there are effects, because there will be effects. Why on earth should all the effects be bad? You hear global warming is bad. Now, if it turned around next week to serious global cooling, would serious global cooling now result in everything being good?
Right.
No, that's bad too, because the people only want a bad outcome. They always tell you this global warming is going to lead to less rain in dry areas and more rain in wet areas. So there's going to be floods. Why? Why shouldn't there be more rain in the Karoo and less rain in the Amazon jungle or something like that? But they always want more rain where it's wet and less rain where it's dry. And that Africa is getting hotter than anybody else for. That's just not the case. You can't get one part of the planet like this warming up at the expense of the other when it's supposed to be radiation coming from the sun. The Earth turns around like this. I've seen stories that South Africa is getting hotter faster than Europe is. It can't be. It's just not physics. It's just not science.
Absolutely, absolutely fascinating insights. If people want to read out a bit more about the side of the story very quickly for the interest of time, where can they sort of look? What are the platforms that are giving this kind of idea insofar as climate change is concerned?
There's numbers of internet sites. There's a famous site called What's Up With That, W2WT. It's the most viewed internet site in the world on climate change that speaks sense. There's some famous scientists. There's Professor Will Happer of Princeton University, Dr. Fred Singer. Names like that one can Google. Once you get onto a few of those, you'll get on a roll and find out all sorts of people and discover a whole world out there which isn't coming to the attention of the magazines on the shelf in the corner cafe.
Brilliant stuff. Thank you very much. Nuclear scientist Dr. Kelvin Kemm, who's also the CEO of Nuclear Afrika. Thank you very much for your time. It was an absolute pleasure.
Welcome, Ayanda.
Right, let's take a quick ad break. When we come back, a conversation I'm equally excited to have. We speak to Rosie Mutene about her book and the many complex and fascinating issues that it touches on. You don't want to miss that. Do stay tuned right here on Newzroom Afrika, channel 405. We'll be right back.